In this, our 23rd lecture, we continue our exploration of life lessons that we learned from the great books. And in this section, our theme of adventure. How to live a life that is filled with adventure, as in the Iliad, or at least to give some deeper meaning to the lives that we have been given or chose to live. And if I could choose one life, I think it'd be an explorer. I think to have sailed with Columbus into what he believed to be a new world, or to have gone with Stanley into Africa, or to have sailed down the river of Brazil with Theodore Roosevelt. All of that are to polar explorations. These were magnificent stories of adventure, and our own country has one of the most splendid examples of adventure in the expedition of William Clark and Meriwether Lewis, that from 1803 to 1806 opened up an entire new world, opened up the world of the Great Plains of our country, and gave us a claim all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. An expedition that was one of the most successful things our country has ever done. Only one American was lost on the expedition, and only one Native American seems to have been killed. It was a diplomatic success, it was a commercial success, and it was a glorious adventure. But it starts with a statesman and the vision of an empire of liberty, what our country could become. And that statesman was Thomas Jefferson, and his life was an adventure. Writing the Declaration of Independence as a young man, living on to be ambassador of France, and then one of our most effective presidents. Whenever I define a statesman, I list 4 qualities that I believe distinguish a statesman from just a politician. A statesman must have a bedrock of principles. A statesman must have a moral compass. A statesman must have a vision. And a statesman must be able to build a consensus to achieve that vision. A bedrock of principles, what do I mean by that? Those are the ideals and values upon which you build your entire life. And Jefferson has enunciated those principles for us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted among men to achieve those principles. With his Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson made us the only nation in history founded on principles. How do you get to be a German? You speak German as your mother tongue. A German will still tell you that. How you were an Englishman in 1776? You were born in England. It was a geographical accident. But we've always said, speak any language you want, come from anywhere, but adopt our principles. And those are the principles of Jefferson. And a moral compass. A moral compass is what very few people have today. Moral compass is different than the antennae we put out today. We like to listen to what people are going to say. But a moral compass believes in absolute right and absolute wrong. And for Jefferson, those principles, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, were absolute rights. They were self-evident, given by God. We might, in our imperfect society, never fully achieve them, but they were the shining example of what is right. And vision. And Jefferson's vision was of us today, a great democracy, prosperous, letting more people live in freedom and prosperity than any time in history. And he could build a consensus to achieve that vision. And the best instance of this was the Louisiana Purchase. Well, you see, in 1802, Jefferson had a serious problem. And that is to say, the Empire of Napoleon had acquired New Orleans and laid claim to the whole of the territory that was called Louisiana. It was a difficult time. In those days, the western parts of our United States, which extended just to the Mississippi, what we would call states like Tennessee and Kentucky today, or even Georgia, they could not, the farmers, put their goods on Amtrak. They couldn't put their goods in airplanes. They couldn't take their goods along interstate highways. they had to get their produce to market by water. They were self-sufficient in much that they raised, but they also needed money to buy necessities like salt or iron tools. They also needed cash money for taxes. So they might turn their corn into whiskey, they might make salt pork, but they had to send it downriver, down the Ohio, for example, and down the Mississippi. And it was only in New Orleans that it could be offloaded onto American ships that would then sail all the way around Florida and come back up. And from time to time, there had been trouble with the Spanish over the port of New Orleans, but now it was acquired by France. And instead of having as our neighbor the decrepit Spanish Empire, we had the most vigorous and warlike ruler in Europe, Napoleon. And Jefferson was worried that Napoleon would use New Orleans as a stranglehold to make us follow his foreign policy. So he made the offer, sending James Monroe to carry out the negotiations, the James Monroe who would later be president, to try to purchase New Orleans. One day, Monroe was brought into the study of the great Emperor Napoleon, and Napoleon said, "I will never sell you New Orleans, but I will sell you New Orleans and the whole of the Louisiana Territory." Well, now could James Monroe just get on the telephone, or could he text message President Jefferson and say, this is the offer he's made? No. So it had to be sent by boat. It could take 2 months. But Monroe wrote immediately, and he cautioned the Emperor Napoleon, now it will take several months to get an answer back. And Congress will not be in session when the president gets this news. And Napoleon liked America. He admired America. And he wanted America as a friend, and he hoped ultimately America would join him against the British. But he also knew this was a very good deal for the Americans, because he was going to sell this vast amount of land for $15 million, 828,000 square miles for $15 million. And so like a good real estate agent, he said, well, all right, but I've got 2 other people who are interested in buying this, so you better make your decision as fast as you can. So the letter came to Jefferson. Sure enough, Congress was not in session. What were you going to do? Jefferson also was a believer in a strict construction of the Constitution. I'm never entirely sure why people call Jefferson a liberal and Alexander Hamilton a conservative. It seems to me that the essence of being a conservative is limited government. And Jefferson believed that that government is best that governs least. Alexander Hamilton was a big government man, wanted more and more power for the government. Jefferson believed that a constitution should be construed very, very carefully. Hamilton was for a very broad construction of the Constitution. It could mean almost anything Hamilton thought it should mean. So Jefferson, from the principle of having a narrow construction of the Constitution and a limited government, was suddenly faced with this idea that the government could purchase all of this land. And it troubled him. But it's another mark of a statesman that a statesman can set priorities. And if we're drawing lessons from the pattern of great lives for our own lives, then one of the most important decisions we make are priorities. And he believed creating an empire of liberty, giving to this country enough land so that there could be a population of small farmers with all the independence that that life meant, was worth setting a priority. And he took some advice, and his advisor said, Mr. President, you are under the Constitution empowered to make treaties. And effectively, this is what this would be, a treaty with France. So he gave the answer, we'll buy it. Then he wondered, well, actually, what have we bought? And he brought in the French ambassador, and they pored over a map of the Louisiana Territory. And the French ambassador said, you know, we really don't know what the Louisiana Territory is. We roughly define it as all that area that is drained by the Missouri River. And that starts off from our little town of St. Louis. Well, where does it end up? I don't know. Somewhere in the big mountains, probably. Is there a Northwest Passage that will go all the way to the sea? We don't know. See, here's our map. Jefferson said, why are those people there with eyes in the stomach? Well, People thought maybe that's the kind of inhabitants there were. What is that? It looks like a camel mixed with a leopard. Yes, yes, maybe that lives out there in those big mountains. So, in other words, you don't know anything about it. That's correct. What about the southern extent of it? Well, there we're not sure either. There's a quarrel with the Spaniards over it. And also, Mr. President, are you aware of the fact that by the treaty with which France got this from Spain, we promised never to sell it? So the Spaniards are going to be very upset that the Emperor Napoleon has sold this in the first place. So you may not have unchallenged legal claim to it. Now, wouldn't that bother you in buying a house? And you don't know where the boundaries of the house are. And in the South, well, it probably are the southern tributaries that drain into the Mississippi River. Well, like the one they call the Red River, maybe, but that's going to be debated with the Spaniards too. So there you are. Nonetheless, we've done it. And now the next step is to build a consensus to achieve it. You can have the best vision in the world as you go through life, in your ordinary life. If you can't get people to go along with it, you'll fail. Isn't that true? So he had to get Congress to agree. Now, the politics of the age were very bitter. And Jefferson, day after day, was assailed in the newspapers by his political enemies. He was looked upon as a radical. He was looked upon as one who wanted to draw us into war with Britain. He was looked upon as having no economic sense. And his enemies centered around figures like John Adams, leaders of the Federalist Party. And this was exactly what they were waiting for. This kind of foolish action by a man who should never have been elected president. And it was looked upon as a kind of bribe to Napoleon, paying $15 million for all this land. And the political enemies of Jefferson, the Federalists, said, the one thing our country has too much of is land. And the thing we don't have enough of is hard cash. And here is President Jefferson spending all this money for a wasteland, because that's what it is, a great American desert. But Jefferson knew how to build a consensus. And one of the reasons he made the purchase of Louisiana was its commercial value. And the petroleum of that day was the beautiful little creature, the beaver. The beaver. Oh, you don't think much of him now, but in those days you couldn't go outside without paying homage to a beaver. The hat you wore was made out of a beaver. The coat you wore to keep you warm in the winter was made out of beaver. This was true in Europe. It was true all over the world. And the noble animal, the beaver, had been hunted to extinction in Siberia. It had been hunted to extinction. There used to be beavers in Britain. It had been hunted to extinction there. And the one place you still had a lot of beavers was the North American continent. And Jefferson believed that this would be an untapped source of beavers. So he went to his congressman from New England and said, don't you have a lot of campaign donors who own clothes factories? Oh, yes, we do. Isn't the cost of beaver a big problem for them? Yes. Wouldn't you like to bring down the cost of beaver for them? Yes. Then will you vote for this? Yes. So he won them over and his critics were silenced. So he had bought this. Now how were you going to make good your claim? You had to find out where the boundaries were. You had to see if it was really possible commercially to exploit this area. Then you had to also see whether there was a Northwest Passage all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And finally, there were a large number of people who lived there who had never been consulted, the Native Americans. Many tribes of them, and nobody had asked them whether they wanted to be Spanish or French or British, are now American. And so word had to be carried to them that they were now part of the United States. Now, the priority you must set as you go through life is to get the right people to carry out the task. No matter what your position is, you need to find the right person to do a job for you. And Jefferson made what his critics said was a very unlikely choice. He chose his own private secretary, Meriwether Lewis. Young man, not even 30 years of age yet, very little military experience. He was a family friend of Jefferson. His family owned some land out in the Blue Ridges of Virginia. They also owned land in Georgia. The young Meriwether Lewis had never had a lot of schooling. The journals that he left behind are filled with all sorts of spelling mistakes. We would view them in strange grammar. But he knew the woods. And when he was a boy of 14, he would walk all the way from Virginia to his family's land in Georgia. So he knew the woods, but Jefferson went to him and said, "Would you like to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean?" Now, wouldn't that be a challenge for you? Wouldn't you ponder it? Wouldn't you rather go back to college? Wouldn't you worry what kind of degrees you might want to get? How would this go down on your curriculum vitae, on your resume? But Meriwether and Lewis knew this was the great opportunity, and he seized it. And Jefferson then gave him a crash course. Crash course in diplomacy, a crash course in cartography, how to map this new area, a crash course in flora and fauna, because part of his job was scientific, to collect a specimen of every creature and flower you met along the way that seemed to be unknown. So how do you stuff these animals? How do you make drawings of the flowers, the plants that you find along the way? And then he said, you know, you're going to need a group of men to go with you. We'll call it the Corps of Discovery, but they're going to get sick. So you need a crash course in medicine, and all of this within 6 months. Learning latitude and longitude, botany. I'm going to send you to Philadelphia, and you can have a medical course with Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the most famous physicians of our day. So there he studied with Dr. Rush, learning how to set bones, and was given the cure-all that Dr. Rush had invented, mercury tablets. Purge. If they're sick, purge them, purge them, purge them. And we can still find camps, locate camps of the Lewis and Clark expedition from the massive amounts of mercury there in the soil. So with all of this, now he's ready to choose a partner. And he chooses a man he had served under briefly in the military, William Clark. Clark's brother had been the heroic figure George Rogers Clark, who had led the American forces, the militia of Virginia, out as far as the Mississippi, capturing it from the British and laying our claim to that fair land. So he asked William Clark by letter, will you go with me? Now here's another opportunity. And Clark said yes. And so the expedition began to form. When Lewis had invited Clark to be part of the expedition, he had promised Clark that they would both be captains. But when the word came from the War Department, only Lewis had the rank of captain, and Clark would have to be a first lieutenant. And when he finally met Clark again, he said, I will understand if you turn this down. The War Department will not let you be a captain. They will not pay you at the rate of captain. But as far as I'm concerned, we'll always be equal in command. Clark shook his hand and said, that's the way it'll be. I don't need anything more. Now, the lesson you learn from life is to find one good friend in that life. And Lewis and Clark became friends, the deepest kind of friends, admiring one another. And there would never be a quarrel with them as they made their way along that journey. Then you had to pick the men. And Lewis would ultimately make this journey with only 33 men, the Corps of Discovery. They were chosen from Army posts, and it was a military expedition, chosen for their knowledge of the woods, their keen eye, and just, I want to do this. Not, would you like to do it? I don't know, I'll have to think about it. No, this is something I want to do. I want to go where someone has never been before. But no American has ever seen, I want to go. I want to see those big mountains. I want to see those vast plains. I want to see the Pacific Ocean. And so they set out. Formalities had to be carried through. The formal transfer of the Missouri-Louisiana territory to the Americans had to be carried through. And the first winter, while these formalities were being carried out, they spent in a reconstructed fort. You can visit it today in its reconstructed form, right along the Mississippi River, just a small ways up from St. Louis. And there the men had to be disciplined. And Lewis and Clark from time to time had to give them lashings, particularly when one of them got into the whiskey barrel and encouraged one of his friends to get drunk, and then they were insolent. They had to be beaten 100 lashes. But after that shakedown that winter, these men would make that whole travel with no more disciplinary problems of any consequence. And Lewis and Clark never had to order them to do anything. Just a suggestion, and the men leapt to it. So all that long way, all these hard conditions, just out of a response of loyalty to their captains. Now that's real motivation. You don't need a motivational speaker to be brought in to teach you that. That comes from the heart of a great figure like Meriwether Lewis. And in May of 1804, they began their journey up, crossing across the state of Missouri, and then on up through what we would call Kansas, and on up the Missouri River. And every day brought some new adventure. All of it carefully recorded day after day by Lewis, or sometimes Clark, in the journals that they had been requested to keep by President Jefferson. They are one of the most original pieces of American literature. If you want to say a great book has to have good grammar in it, if you want to say it has to have good spelling, if you want to say it has to be written in flowery prose or poetry, then no. But it is a great theme of the adventure, and it is written in the straightforward language of an ordinary frontiersman of the day. Noble, not flowery. And it can still speak across the ages. In fact, the historian Stephen Ambrose said that reading the journals of Lewis and Clark in 1975 changed his whole life. And ever thereafter, every summer while he lived, he would take his family to paddle or walk in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. And that's something I would urge every one of you to do. Put your family in an RV and go out along that way. Some of it's still quite untamed and unchanged from when Lewis and Clark first laid eyes upon it. And meeting the Native Americans. The first tribe they met in any detail were the Omahas and the Otos. And then on upriver to where they met the dreaded Sioux, the Yankton Sioux, and then the Teton Sioux. And there they almost had to go to war because the Sioux were ferocious and didn't like any strangers to come into their territory. But this was a diplomatic mission, and Lewis and Clark proved to be very good diplomats. They didn't speak any of the native languages, but they used sign language. They would pick out the people they thought were the chiefs. They would present them with a medallion that President Jefferson had given them with his face on one side and clasped hands and a peace pipe on the other. Give them trading goods and then be on their way. By the winter, they had to go into quarters among the Mandan tribe near what we would call Bismarck, North Dakota today. And there they built their fort. You can visit it again in a reconstructed form. And in that cold winter, when the temperature sank all the way down to 40 below, one day there came into their quarters a French trader, Charbonneau. He brought with him his 16-year-old wife, Sacagawea, who was about to have a baby. And Charbonneau, the French fur trader, said, "You are going into the land where no Americans have ever been before. Isn't that right? No fur traders have ever really been there. And the language that they speak there, even the sign language, is very different from what you've encountered. I will go with you if you pay me a good wage, and we will take my wife with us. But your wife's about to have a baby." "I know, but a woman with a small baby will prove that we're not a war party and will make it easy for us to pass. Moreover, my wife is not from here. She was raised in the big mountains. She is a Shoshone, and she speaks that language, and you will have to win the Shoshone over to get to the sea." So they set off again that spring as soon as the ice permitted, and they made their way across what we would call Montana today and began to come into the land of the great Rocky Mountains. And all along the way, trouble, hardship. They had heard about the Great Falls, but they thought they could get around them in one day. It took them 18 days carrying their canoes and all their trade goods and supplies, their feet torn by the cactus, their moccasins ripped to shreds, and then on, until they finally reached the Continental Divide, which was the true end of the Louisiana Territory, and they drank from the spring of the Missouri River, from the source of it. And you can still go today, dip your hands in that cool water and drink from it. But they had to get to the sea before winter came on. And they needed horses. And they encountered the Shoshone Indians, and they began to try to deal with them in trade. The Shoshone absolutely refused to give them horses. And in order to negotiate with the Shoshone chief, Kameawait, Lewis would speak in English to Drouillard. Drouillard would speak in French to Charbonneau. Charbonneau would speak in the Mandan language to his wife, Sacagawea, and she would speak in Hidatsa to the chief. And so it kept going back and forth and got a little confused, as you can imagine. And then finally, Kamehameha kept looking at this woman, and Sacagawea kept looking at this Shoshone chief. And suddenly she squealed, "Little brother!" He said, "Little sister! It's you! We thought you were dead. You were carried off by a war party. No, it's me. Let them have the horses." And so Kamehameha, the Shoshone, gave them their horses. And you can still visit that spot. It's under a reservoir today, but it's called Camp Fortunate. And they made their way on until finally in November, Clark wrote in the journal, "Ocean in view. Oh, great joy." They wintered there at Fort Clatsop and then had to make the whole way back. You ever made a long trip and then realize you got to go all the way back? So they came back exploring other routes until finally on September the 23rd, 1806, the bells of St. Louis began to toll. That's Lewis and Clark and their brave men, only one of them having died along the way of a ruptured appendix. Operation that couldn't be carried out until 1884. So that was all they lost. And word was carried to Jefferson that not only had the expedition survived, but it had opened up this whole new world. And Lewis and Clark came back to Washington. Both were celebrated. And then Jefferson made Meriwether Lewis governor of this new territory. And he chose his friend William Clark to be his superintendent for Indian affairs, as it was called. But Jefferson kept asking Lewis, "Where are those journals? When are you going to bring them into print?" And Lewis seemed loath to go and take up his new position there in St. Louis, and the criticism began. And it finally became quite clear that Lewis had really no administrative abilities whatsoever. He finally made it out to St. Louis, where he was conspired against by his bureaucratic second in command. And then, the journal still not having been published, there was a change of administration in Washington. And Lewis suddenly found that the letter of credit that he had been using to buy all these supplies and trade goods given to him by President Jefferson would no longer be honored by the new administration. And to him, this was an assault upon his honor. He had given his word of honor to pay these debts in the name of the government, and now it had been refused. So in the fall of 1809, determined to avenge his honor, he left St. Louis, still the governor, and made his way back towards Washington. His good friend William Clark begged him not to go. He believed that Lewis was drinking too much, to stay, settle this through administrative channels. But Lewis pushed on with only one servant. And by October, he had come to near the little town of Nashville. And there, in a little cabin where he had taken refuge for the night, the lady willing to give him supper and a room, he paced up and down, looking always to the west, drinking, looking to the west, thinking of that glorious adventure he had had and how cruel the world had turned out to be. And around midnight, the landlady, Mrs. Grinder, heard a shot. And when they went in, Lewis was lying on the floor saying, "I cannot do anything right," and stabbed himself. And about morning, that great heart stopped beating. His friend and mentor Jefferson wrote, "He was always of a melancholy disposition. He lived only for that one bright moment." Now, as we draw our life lessons, we understand that Lewis was a man of destiny, a man chosen for one mission. He had one task in life. What he did before was meaningless. What he would do afterwards was a failure. But he seized that one destiny, and he gained immortal fame. And I tell you, blessed are you If you can find that one destiny you have in life, live it to its fullest, and achieve your mission, everything else in your life counts for nothing compared to that destiny.